As you know, today we're doing a hands-on workshop, Black Basta ransomware crew techniques and effective defense. So if we want to just kind of get things kicked off here, we can kind of go through an agenda of what we'll be doing. We'll start off with an introduction. So a lot of this came from Black Basta chat logs that were leaked. So we'll talk a little bit about Black Basta. We'll talk a little bit about their activities, where they how they started, all that kind of fun stuff. Uh, we will then hand it over to Nick, and Nick is going to do a technical deep dive and talk through some of the actual techniques that Black Basta has employed. Some of the stuff we kind of knew already, but the good thing about these chat logs is that we can see exactly what they were doing. And so we've gone through these logs and these chats, and we've seen what what were they actually talking about? What kind of things were they trying? What kind of organizations were they targeting? That kind of thing. We'll then move into defensive countermeasures. So how you can protect yourself against these types of attacks. So Black Basta, for all intents and purposes, kind of does the same thing that most ransomware crews do. And so if we're able to take this intelligence from these logs as to what they're doing and all that kind of stuff, we can build defenses against them to hopefully help us in the future. We'll then get into a live demo. Again, Nick will take it from there. And then we have set up a hands-on lab. So you'll be able to actually try some of these things out. See if you can join a ransomware crew. Don't do that. That's not true. But don't do that. So I've been talking for a little bit, but we haven't done any quick intros yet. My name is Corey Wolf. I'm the director of offensive security at Risk 360. My team does all the red teaming, penetration testing, adversary emulation, all that kind of good stuff. Nick is a senior security consultant on the OffSec team at Risk 360. So Nick's primary focus is around payload development, EDR evasion, red teaming, that kind of stuff. This is what we're going to talk about today is really Nick's bread and butter, and so he's more than capable of talking about it. And then if you're new to Risk 360, you might be wondering why everything says Armada. Armada is simply the advanced technical services arm at Risk 360. So when you hear Armada powered by Risk 360, all that's saying is that that's the advanced technical services team that does things like red teaming, attack surface management, continuous testing, that kind of stuff. As we mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about ransomware in general. Excuse me, ransomware in general. We'll put a little bit of focus on Black Basta in particular, and then we'll kind of get into their TTPs and that kind of thing. So ransomware crews. Unfortunately, it is incredibly easy to get started and create your own ransomware crew. In fact, there's a video on our YouTube if you're interested. I forget the exact title, where it's myself and Christian Hyatt going through ransomware as a service and the whole business model behind it. But for those of you that are not familiar, ransomware as a service is basically these bigger ransomware crews provide platforms that, for all intents and purposes, anyone can sign up and become an affiliate of that ransomware crew. And what that does is that provides that affiliate with, the encryptors needed to actually perform the encryption during the ransomware incident, provides them with the platforms to receive payments. It's basically, it's as a service, right? And so what this means is that it's very easy for anyone to really start a ransomware crew. If you look into the threat intelligence behind these groups, there's some that are 5 people. There's some that there's 100 people. Even I think Conti at one point was like 120 people, something like that. So it's really easy to get started. It's really profitable. We're going to get into some of that in just a minute, but because it is ransomware as a service platforms, it's very easy to get started and basically create your own ransomware group, which is why we saw such an increase in it over the last decade or so. And in 2023, total ransomware payments, it exceeded $1 billion. So that means that across all the ransomware crews, I think the number was like 1.25 billion, but it was over $1 billion in 2023. And that is a lot of money. Conti, for example, in 2022 was estimated to bring in between 200 and 250 million dollars from that one crew. These are real businesses, right? They really are. They are real businesses that have lots of employees. They have processes. They have SOPs. They have all that kind of stuff. And because of these ransomware as a service platforms, which Black Basta was, it made it really easy to get started. it became very easy for them to gain access to these networks and actually exploit them and ransom. And the ransomware as a service would handle everything for them. And so they're big businesses. They make a lot of money, and it's very profitable and very easy to get started. So today, of course, everything's focused around the Black Basta chat leaks, which it was about 200,000 messages that were leaked, and that happened in February. So 200,000 messages. This gives us a lot of insights into their day-to-day operations and what they're talking about. Something similar happened with Conti, which is the one I just mentioned. It did about 250 million in 2022. A similar thing happened with Conti in 2023. Their chat messages were leaked as well. And this provides a lot of threat intelligence for us, especially for those of us that are willing to go through these chat logs, read the messages, put the pieces together, and kind of figure all this stuff out. So there's a lot of similarities between Conti and Black Basta. And in fact, a lot of times when these groups disband for whatever reason, when they disband, most of them just go start another crew, right? And so if you look at the threat intelligence over time between the different groups, you see a lot of similarities. So, for example, Black Basta used an encryptor that was, I think, 80%, or I think it was 80% of 80% of it was from Conti's encryptor. So they basically took whatever encryptor they had when they were in Conti, they did some changes, made probably made some upgrades, and then started using it, and that became the Black Basta encryptor. So the same thing happened to Conti, and these messages were leaked in 2023. Some people went through and started to really put the pieces together. In fact, SecureWorks did a lot of research at the time into going through these messages and starting to put some of start to gather some intelligence from them. And what we can see is this is the structure that SecureWorks had put together between all the messages. And so what you can see here is I think Conti was 100 people, but at the time their leader was an individual named Stern. And there you could think of this as different business units. And so they had tool development, they had biz ops, they had ransomware operations. Those are the actual operators going in and running the encryptors, saving the notes or all the messages on the machines for the victim to contact Conti. Biz ops, tool development, so that's where they're building, um, new payloads, new TTPs, that kind of thing. So on the left, you can see basically Conti and all their different business ops. On the right, you can see a couple of other groups. So for those of you that are not familiar, TrickBot, Iced ID, and Emotet are malware that is just been around forever. TrickBot, maybe a year ago, they took down a bunch of TrickBot infrastructure, but these are the things that are sent in like phishing emails, that are sent in malvertising. They're just basically like pieces of malware that are bot networks, right? That's basically what they are. And so Stern apparently is a very powerful figure at the time, because not only does Stern run Conti, a ransomware group, he also runs the initial access vectors, right? Because there's a couple different phases to this. Of course, the first phase to any type of infection is initial access. In the ransomware world, there's things called initial access brokers, where they're the ones that are actually going in, gaining access to the networks, and then they either sell it, or if they're an affiliate of a ransomware crew, they use that service to then ransom the organization. So Stern had, I guess, vertical integration. If you're into business, Stern had vertical integration in the ransomware world. Not only was he able to infect the host machines, he was able to then ransomware them, right? And so it's very big business. And we're going into this because it's important to understand the basics of ransomware, how big it actually is, how advanced these organizations actually are, and what goes on with them day to day. In fact, here's a message that was sent to Stern from one of his assistants that I believe it was Mango. So if you're looking on the left there, you'll see Mango is a bigger circle. So which means Mango was a manager, right? This is a message from Mango to Stern telling Stern that tomorrow is salary day, so tomorrow is payday. And you can see there they're listing out all the team members, the number of people, and the dollar amount that Stern needed to pay out to pay everyone. As you can see, the second to last, well, technically the third to last line there, it says total 146,294 divided by 2. So apparently they get paid bi-weekly. I mean, you got to think about it in these situations. The people that are working here, a lot of times they're just doing it as a job. I mean, they're literally clocking in at 9 a.m., clocking out at 5, and they get paid in Bitcoin or Monero or whatever, but crypto, and they get paid every 2 weeks. So as you can see there, the needed money for that payday was $73,147. So that's a pretty big operation. I mean, that's a monthly, I think that's just labor costs there, right? Monthly labor cost of 146. That's a big business. That's a big business. To put a little bit more into perspective, as far as how big these organizations can get, we can start to put together sort of a P&L, a monthly P&L. So this is monthly. This is a monthly example. We can start to understand how big these businesses are, how much they actually bring in, and what it looks like and what their profit looks like. So in this case, Conti and Black Bass as well was a ransomware as a service platform. So if you go through all their different revenue, so 180 to 200 million dollars estimated to bring in 180 to 200 million dollars in 2022. So if you break that out monthly, that's roughly 16.6 million dollars in revenue every month. And you can see we just break out examples as far as where that revenue would come from. Ransomware payments, that's where they're actually performing the ransomware operations. Data extortion payments, we're going to talk a lot about that. Black Basta was big on data extortion, but that's basically where the victim organization pays, and then the ransomware crew says, okay, here's your decryptor. Now pay us again, or we're going to release all this data. And then the RAS, just to give an example of what it could look like, would be about 7.5 million. We know from that message that their salaries under their expenses their salaries monthly were about 146. Their infrastructure, again, from that message that we just saw before, was about $8,000. And then there's a cost of doing business, which is about 20%. So that cost of doing business is bribes. It's paying government officials. It's the reason why historically, threat actors responsible for taking part in ransomware operations were not apprehended. Many of these groups, they live free. They do whatever they want to do. They're ransoming, organizations all around the world, and they're able to just do that and go on with their day and live their normal life. And that's their cost of doing business. So it's about 20% kickbacks, basically. So even if you take all those expenses, and again, in this example, knowing they made between 180 and 200 million in 2022, their total expenses for the month would be about 3.5 million bucks, which would net them roughly $13 million every month net. So that's after expenses, right? So it's a very profitable business, and these organizations are able to operate freely and do what they want. We'll see if that changes. In fact, we are starting to notice a decrease in ransomware operations just in general. So I don't have the number, but I'm pretty sure in 2024, I think Chainalysis is still putting the numbers together, but I think in 2024, the total ransomware payments did go down. So like I mentioned earlier, in 2023, ransomware payments exceeded 1 billion. I believe in 2024, they have gone down, but it's still a very profitable business that they can use to just basically print money. When it comes to Black Basta, so we talked about how a lot of these groups, when one is disbanded, they kind of move on to the next one. A lot of these groups have very similar TTPs and tooling and that kind of thing. But as far as Black Basta goes, we do know that they emerged in early 2022. And within their first 2 weeks of being active, they attacked at least 20 organizations and successfully received payment, actually. So they came out of the gate just ready to go. They started up, and again, within 2 weeks, they had at least 20 organizations that we know of. They also provided, well, we'll see. A lot of their, so I keep saying past tense because a lot of their, so it appears as though Black Basta is no more as of right now. But they did provide, and I guess technically still do provide, a ransomware as a service platform. So again, not only are they responsible for actually performing the ransomware operations, they provide the tools and platform for others to do so as well. They're known for double extortion. So this is again where they ransomware the organization. They say, pay us so you can decrypt your files. The organization pays, and then Black Basta comes back and says, pay us again, or we're releasing your information. They're just known for doing that. So all ransomware crews will usually release the data, though, like even if they're attempting double extortion, 9 times out of 10 they still release the data. And Black Basta though was very specific. So like if most ransomware crews, when they released it, it would be on their Onion site, so it'll be on their Tor site, their dark website. Black Basta had a ClearNet site that you could go to. I think it was bbdata.top. I think it's down now, so it doesn't matter. But they would put it out on a ClearNet, and they were very focused on making that data that they released easily accessible. Other ransomware crews would just put it in, what are those things called? Torrent. There we go. Or some random way to actually share it. Black Basta made it easy for people to get that data, which made the threat even, it made it a bigger threat for those organizations, because sure, the data will get released, with other organizations, with other ransomware crews, but with Black Basta, they knew that it was going to be front and center. It was going to be super easy, low effort for anyone to just go and grab that data. So of course that increases the risk. But they were well known for this. They were well organized when it came to that release of data, and they did double extortion all the time. They were a little bit different in that most ransomware crews just go for low hanging fruit. Don't get me wrong, Black Basta did, but they were known for being, a little bit more targeted. Again, Nick's going to get into this with TTPs in just a bit, but they didn't necessarily just do spray and pray. So they specifically went after, Palo Alto firewalls, for example. In some cases, they even built their own ODAs. Most ransomware crews just, again, spray and pray. They'd scan the internet. They'd know that a public vulnerability came out. They would immediately go after and just scan the internet and see what they could find and just, pop shells, right? But Black Basta was a little different in that they did do targeted ops, probably 50% of the time. And that made things a little bit easier when it came to attribution and that kind of thing. I mentioned this a bunch of times already, but there are many similarities. Conti, the decryptor being one. We believe that a lot of the members were the same from Conti, and very similar. So if we take a look at all known ransomware activity from 2024. So remember, I say known because this is just where this data that you're seeing now is taken from the leak sites of these ransomware crews. So this means that the crew specifically said, we ransom this place, we ransom that place, right? And so we can track that across all their dark websites, and we can put that data together. So I say known because we know about these. Oftentimes, if an organization has a ransomware incident and they pay, depending on the ransomware group, most of them won't announce that they were paid by that victim, right? So you won't even know that it happened. So I say known, right? Black Basta did a lot, and they were very busy. But the fact remains that in 2024, there were only about 3% of all known ransomware events. Only 3%. And we're talking about a crew that brought in millions of dollars every day, every month. They were responsible for some of the biggest attacks, and ransomware events that we're aware of, Ascension Healthcare being one of them from last year. Ascension Healthcare was basically brought to their knees, and this was Black Basta. And they were only, 3%. roughly 3% of all known ransomware events. I mentioned earlier that they are no longer, at least it appears though they're no longer active. Their their leak sites are down. Their ClearNet site is down. Uh, from these chat logs, we do know that there was some internal conflict, which appears as though that's why they've disbanded. And so it started to really cause issues for them. In fact, I think the last known activity was from January of 2025. At least the last time that they announced that they had um, attacked an organization was in January of 2025. And so, there was some definitely back and forth. There was some internal issues there. And of course, we know that because of chat logs that were leaked last month on Telegram by a user known as Exploit Whispers. Lots of similarities between Conti, lots of similarities, not only in methods, tools, and techniques, but also how they met their end, and what happened when they met their end, the chat logs and all that kind of thing. These chat logs, 200,000 messages, and some interesting things that they showed us is that it appears that they have offices. So they are, again, they're businesses, right? And it appears as though they had offices in Moscow, at least two of them that we know of, which makes sense. I mean, they have employees. They're just working a 9 to 5, clocking in and out for their shift. So you need offices, right? You need to be able to meet with government officials and do do business things, right? So of course you need an office. But from these chat logs, we can see that it appears as though they did have two offices in Moscow for regular business operations. This is the biggest. So the biggest thing that we've seen from AI in general when it comes to threat actors is that they're using ChatGPT. Specifically, ChatGPT is called out in these chat logs, but they're using LLMs and AI, off the shelf AI, to improve their phishing messages, improve their fake PDFs and anything else that they're generating. That's been the primary use case for AI. When AI first came out, everybody kind of started freaking out. There's going to be these all autonomous systems that are just going to, ransomware crews are just going to go after you, right? And now, what do you think? They use it for the low hanging fruit, for phishing, and for various malicious documents, so that the grammar was correct, so it sounded more like a native English speaker. Uh, this is kind of what we thought was going on, but these chat logs confirm that for us, that they're really just using ChatGPT specifically to make well crafted phishing lures in documents that they can use to infect users. Their leader, apparently, so their leader was arrested in Armenia in June of 2024, and according to these chat logs, there was some back and forth between their leader, Oleg, and some high-ranking Russian officials when he was arrested in Armenia. He did escape, so I believe he escaped. I don't think that I don't know that the Russian officials actually like got him bailed out. I believe that he actually escaped and then received assistance from those Russian officials to get out of Dodge and go back to Russia. So this isn't anything that I guess this isn't anything new. We've known this, but being able to see this in the chat logs is really important, and just solidifies a lot of things that we've been looking at from a threat intelligence perspective. But he did appear to get some assistance from high-ranking officials. Something that kind of sets them apart. So they talk a lot about, which, let's be honest, most threat actors are using some form of of cracked Cobalt Strike. So if you're not familiar with Cobalt Strike, it's a commercial command and control framework and application, right? That people like us in OffSec that are doing penetration testing can purchase. It has a lot of features. It's really good. It's like kind of it's been around forever, right? And they're um they've been doing it since day one. And so what a lot of these threat actors do is they get, cracked or unlicensed versions of Cobalt Strike and use it in their ops. And we see it all the time. In fact, I think one might argue that threat actors use Cobalt Strike more than OffSec people do. But One thing that kind of separates them apart is that they were starting to develop their own custom C2 framework and infrastructure written in C. I believe they were towards the end of that. And I think they were starting to get ready to kind of throw that out and start using it in the wild. And then, this kind of internal conflict started with them. And from what I understand, I don't think they actually started to implement it. But that's something that sets them apart. You don't typically see that from at least ransomware groups. They're usually using off the shelf kind of stuff and just going for it. So we're going to get into uh, some TTPs and actual attacks and everything. But I think it was important to kind of set the groundwork of how ransomware groups operate, and then specifically how Black Basta operates and the types of interesting things that we saw in these chat logs. It's so if you're not familiar, there's a messaging protocol called Matrix. So before, threat actors used to use Telegram, and I guess technically they still do. But a few months back, the founder of Telegram was arrested in Paris, basically because Paris authorities were upset that Telegram wasn't providing any information to them. So, if a government made a request to Telegram for a specific channel, related to user IP addresses, usernames, emails, or that kind of thing, Telegram would just ignore them. Got to the point where the governments got tired of it, and the founder of Telegram was arrested in Paris and started to cooperate with at least Paris authorities. I'm not sure who else. And so what we saw is a big exodus off of Telegram onto this messaging protocol, Matrix, which is where these chat messages are from. And so 200,000 messages, a lot of stuff to dig through, but that's just a high level of the threat intelligence and the background of Black Basta. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, we do a much bigger deep dive into the things that we've seen from a threat intelligence perspective in our cybersecurity trends report. That's something you're interested in checking out. There's a lot more info. There's a lot of um, threat intelligence and other information gathered from 2024. And some trends that we think you're going to see in 2025. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I'd highly recommend that you check out our 2025 cybersecurity trends report.
So I'm going to talk through some of the OffSec TTPs that we were able to retrospectively look back at these chat logs and see kind of what was happening behind the scenes, which is a very unique look that you don't typically get. We're typically seeing things in DFIR reports and stuff like that. But we were able to actually look and see what they were saying to each other. In some cases, it was downright funny, but because we realize everybody has technical issues, even ransomware crews. So we'll get into some of the initial access vectors that they focus on, which was social engineering, credential stuffing, and public-facing vulnerabilities. So for social engineering, this is always going to be a popular vector for initial access because you're just getting someone to do something and give you access that they already legitimately should have, which is not suspicious in terms of like detection standpoint and stuff like that. So this is a very good method for initial access that is oftentimes the easiest because humans, they always say it's like cliche at this point, but humans are the weakest link. And we'll talk about some of the potential social engineering tactics that could be used. Credential stuffing. This is extremely popular now because of the popularity of information stealing malware, which collects these huge troves of username password logs and cookies and basically gives these ransomware crews the ability to just spray credential stuffing against public-facing infrastructure. And then public-facing vulnerabilities, I know Corey touched on it a bit. CVEs is a big focus for them because basically they can look for public exploit code or reverse engineer some of the CVEs themselves and try to develop some exploit code, or in some case purchase 0 days or 1 days. But we can dive into One of the interesting initial access vectors was the use of Quick Assist, which, to be pretty honest, before this, I hadn't known too much about it, but this is a native uh, built-in Windows executable, which you can literally run or invoke by hitting Control Windows key Q. It'll pop open this thing. You say you enter a code, and it gives them screen sharing ability. And this can occur over the internet. It's not like Active Directory focused or anything like that. And then you can request access, kind of like TeamViewer or something. And then they have remote access to your computer, and they can open up CMD, PowerShell, whatever else, download secondary remote access tools like AnyDesk or Atera or something like that. And then here we could see this is just a snippet from the actual chat logs where they're talking about Quick Assist, how to basically open it up. It's in English here, and then there's like a Russian comment after that. But they have been reported to use Quick Assist for initial access back in 2024, and we were able to kind of just confirm this by looking back at their discussions about using it. And it's kind of brings a good advantage that you don't have to have them install some secondary software to get remote access. It's basically built into Windows, and you could see how someone might easily fall for a social engineering pretext that involves this. The next thing would be RDS. So this is a remote desktop through the browser, which is an add-on for Windows servers. It's at this URL, rdweb login.aspx. And this is a perfect target for credential stuffing attacks because you can basically programmatically test credentials against a web endpoint, and then boom, you have Windows initial access, not only initial access, but the context of a domain user typically, which gives you even more abilities within on-prem AD. So there was a bunch of these sent throughout the chat logs where it's just URL endpoints. And yes, these are credentials from the actual chat leaks, but by this time, if they didn't change them, then that's kind of on them. But this was a big focus for them, just sending these potential correct logins. I'm not sure. We don't go and check that, but and then from there they can that's initial access, and they can just move on with the intrusion. And then public facing vulnerabilities. So they're very opportunistic when it comes to public facing vulnerabilities. So if a new CVE comes out that is high severity, remote code execution, authentication bypass, something like that, that has either public exploit code or they can figure out exploit code for it, they're taking full advantage of that. They're typically targeting these endpoint devices that are exposed over the internet. So VPN appliances, Citrix, workspaces, stuff like that, because by nature, they're a lot of times exposed to the internet. So when a CVE comes out for them, it's very bad for the organization, and they're trying to figure out which way they can weaponize an exploit and massively spray it and get as many footholds as possible. Again, here's some discussion about them talking about buying 0 days, and then what's the price of a 1 day, and somebody says 25K. So this might be for just speculation for a company that they were unable to breach, but they think would be highly profitable to breach, that they might be willing to buy 0 days or 1 day or something like that. And then here's just another grep for Citrix endpoints where they're sending tons of credential stuffing, username password pairs into different Citrix workspace URLs. Moving on to lateral movement, I'm going to talk about remote desktop, PsExec curve roasting. They're kind of doing the basic stuff here. If they find credentials, they're trying to move laterally using built-in RDP or silently install other remote desktop tools like AnyDesk or whatnot. PSExec is common sysinternals tool that is widely used for sysadmin, but also OffSec lateral movement because it is like a legitimate Windows signed utility. And curb roasting is like the tried and true first thing to check for when you get a domain user in on-prem AD, because if there are service accounts that you can crack the hash for from the ticket granting service ticket, then you can escalate a lot of times it privileges. And we saw them using this technique quite a bit with Rubius, but I'll talk about that. So remote desktop tooling, they're using just like legitimate tooling, AnyDesk, Atera, TeamViewer, stuff like that, because they are real tools that are signed by, like when I say signed, I'm talking about digital certificate binary code signing. So they're like trusted binaries, unless they're added to like a potentially unwanted program list or something like that. For your Intune configuration or EDR configuration, um, they're typically less suspicious than dropping like a long infection chain with Cobalt Strike and whatever else, whatever TTPs, malware TTPs they employ. Because if they don't need to risk burning those payloads, then and they could just drop a remote team viewer or something like that, that's going to be a better option. And it also has built-in persistence because most of these startup with Windows, like auto startup with Windows, and that's not suspicious because the real program does that. But they heavily use this, whether it's from their initial social engineering pretext or they're doing like a silent install with like an MSI package or something like that. PSExec, so you could see it's like a legitimately signed Microsoft executable, basically allows you to execute commands on a remote system, whether you need, whether you have credentials for the user or not, because a lot of times you just have a process that has a Windows logon token associated with the user, and you can just use the Windows logon token to execute in the context of that user on a remote system. It's so popular and useful that Cobalt Strike has a built-in command for it, remote exec with PSExec option. And this is a legitimate snippet taken from the chat logs where they're running run DLL32 on a remote system, invoking a XLS spreadsheet. It's not an XLS spreadsheet, it's a DLL, but I'm not too sure how successful that is for defense evasion, like renaming a DLL to XLS spreadsheet, but they do use that quite a bit, which is kind of an interesting IOC right there, running run DLL on a .xls file. But anyways, it's going to load that DLL into run DLL process and execute it on the remote system. Curb roasting. So this is a well-known TTP. It's been around forever, I feel like, and basically has the potential for recovering service account passwords if they are not that strong or you can crack them. It also has a high potential for privilege escalation because a lot of times service accounts are given higher privileges in the domain, if not sometimes domain admin. And they are taking advantage of this, running checks for this. Again, we see them using execute assembly, which runs .NET files, .NET assembly files. And they're using Rubius, which is like open source tool that people in pen testing and OffSec use. And they're doing the Kerberos option and checking for only service counts that are admins. And the interesting thing in this is that they're dropping the hashes to disk on the victim machine. And I thought this was pretty interesting because you don't need to do this. Like Cobalt Strike will give you the output and you can just copy it. But they actually do drop it to disk in a file called hs.txt. And the format for these Kerberos hashes are very unique. So no like non-malicious file should ever have this hash format in it unless you were performing a Kerberos attack. So pretty interesting IOC right there. And all of the other ones, all of the other commands we saw them running Kerberos with Rubius did this where they're dropping it to disk. The only reason I could think of is the hash is already formatted so that they can be thrown right into like Hashcat, but it seems like an unnecessary step to me at least. All right, data exfil. They're typically using rclone or WinSCP, both legitimate utilities. They're hunting for sensitive files, think about things that would be very bad if they were leaked, like things that would cause potential like expensive lawsuits or fines from regulatory bodies. And they're checking local files and network files, think like SMB shares, NAS, and deleting shadow copies. Typically, this is built into the ransomware utility itself. So it's preventing them from restoring files from a Windows backup or a Windows snapshot. rclone is a legitimate utility used in a lot of DevOps stuff. Basically, it allows you to transfer files to Mega, FTP, Google Drive, basically anything, Amazon S3. It's super useful tool for file transfer, but it's also super useful for data exfil. So in another legitimate or another snippet taken from the chat here, you can see them copying the entire user's directory to an FTP server, and they're passing in just a configuration file that they probably dropped to disk, and it's basically just going to sync those files to the FTP server before they go ahead and do their ransomware. They dropped a ton of these in the chats where they're syncing them basically all to FTP servers, which is interesting because a lot of the reporting on them was discussing mega.nz, another file sharing site or file storage site that you guys are going to use in the lab. But no, there wasn't a lot of talk about mega.nz in the leak chats. It was mostly all to these FTP servers. And a lot of them were run from, or at least what was sent in the chats were from Linux hosts. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the double extortion method, which Corey talked about a little bit. Basically, they exfiltrate files, deploy the ransomware, demand ransomware payment, and then they get paid. And since they've already exfiltrated all of the data, they still have it to be able to leak it or sell it, and they can get paid again. And it works because there's so much pressure on them from customers, regulatory bodies, and just like reputation in the media. How much is it going to drop your stock price? So, and if you're talking about PHI data, you're talking about lawsuits from individual customers that would cost millions and millions of dollars. Okay, so what is it going to cost that we just pay them this ransom? And as long as they have a reputation of not actually releasing the leaked data after paid, then there's a decent chance the company might pay it if they have enough funds built in for that, which in a lot of cases, Black Basta was using Zoomai to check the actual potential insurance payouts to calculate what they wanted for negotiations.
Why FTP? Like, why aren't they just dropping it?
Or you mean just dropping it to Mega?
Yeah.
One of the main things I could think of is just paying for a Mega license that had enough data to support it. Or maybe Mega could be indicted or whatever the term is for releasing data on it. Whereas if they self-host an FTP server, they might not be, host an FTP server in Romania or something. They might not be on the hook for releasing like what went on that server. But Mega, as I don't know what country Mega belongs to, but they might be on the hook for releasing some of that data. That's the thing that comes to mind, but I'm not sure.
No, I mean that lines up. That lines up.
I see a question in the chat. What kind of encryption techniques were used? I believe it was Cha-Cha 20 or something like that. I forget what the number is, but uh, I believe it was that CHA encryption algorithm.
So Nick, anything else that you think from what we covered so far as the TTPs? You know, what are the main takeaways there?
One of the main takeaways for me is using execute assembly a lot, which is pretty interesting because if you use Cobalt Strike, you know it's a fork and run type execution where it's spawning a process and then injecting into it, which can be quite loud. And most EDRs are pretty attuned to that type of thing. So it makes me question some of the endpoints that they're operating on, if they had EDRs in place, if they disabled them through some means, or maybe they just targeted endpoints that didn't have EDRs. In some cases, there were talks about like a internal tool called Backstab, which supposedly disabled EDRs at the kernel level. Um, this I didn't find a lot of information about in the leak chats, but it has been like reported on in different DFIR reports and stuff like that. So it's kind of a question of whether the endpoints, what was the state of security on these endpoints that they were running things like Rubius, Kerberos to dump hashes onto disk, and then stuff like execute assembly with the one I just said. I forgot it, but yeah.
Backstab?
Now the fork and run execute assembly
Oh.
process, like we did get a look. I didn't cover it in here, but we did get a look at one of their Cobalt Strike malleable C2 profiles, which is interesting because they were sending full log of the malleable C2 profile, which, if you know, it basically tells you a ton of information about how that beacon process is going to behave on the endpoint. Stuff like the actual endpoints calling back to, the URIs, the process injection techniques, like different headers that are added to the HTTP requests and stuff like that. So that can be dissected and IOCs can be extracted from that. And I probably plan to throw that up on somewhere public where people can download it and take a look at it. But yeah, some interesting takeaways.
Cool. So yeah, those were the TTPs. I think I'll steal the screen back here. So we talked a little bit about the threat intelligence chat logs. We talked a little bit about the TTPs that we saw in those chat logs. So I guess the next question is, you know, what can you do to stop this kind of stuff? And so there's one that Nick mentioned, Quick Assist. So one option that you have there is to simply uninstall it. You can do this through SCCM. You can do this through endpoint management. You can do this through a number of ways. But basically, unless your organization, your IT support, I guess, is using this, you should uninstall it. You know, Nick mentioned in the chat logs how he saw it a lot. You know, they're using it, and it's much easier than getting the victim to download AnyDesk or any one of those kinds of remote management tools. It's built into Windows. It's super easy. You basically just send them a code. They put the code in, and you're good to go. And so, unless you're using this across the enterprise, you should definitely get rid of it. I mean, there's always going to be MFA. I don't know that I need to go on about that one. Enable MFA. One of the actually it was the biggest data breach in US. It was the biggest breach of US PHI in history with Change Healthcare. Nick showed a screenshot before about how they were doing credential stuffing, and that whole screenshot, and he even said it, that constantly they're looking for Citrix hosts with credential stuffing. This is exactly what happened with Change Healthcare last year. And I believe it was 200 million Americans PHI was exfiltrated because Change Healthcare had a Citrix host that was facing the public internet, and the threat actors used credential stuffing on that Citrix host and gained access that way. There was no MFA enabled, so Um, enable MFA, right? Enable MFA, get rid of quick assist. You got to do it. You should always be performing user access reviews as well. So if your organization is part of or is taking part in ISO 27001 or a couple other frameworks, this is required. So you probably should be doing it anyways. But you should be looking and seeing: are you decommissioning old accounts? Are you offboarding people? Uh, are there test accounts that are sitting in there with password 123 or whatever it might be? But you should routinely perform user access reviews. And like Nick had mentioned with Kerber roasting has a big focus on service accounts in on-prem Active Directory. And so you want to, you know, make sure that you pay particular attention to that. Uh, there's cases where I know, I know that Nick's been on engagements, for example, and he's performed Kerber roasting, and at times gotten 100 service accounts, right, or more, and they all had weak passwords. So, you can take when you do Kerber roasting, you basically get a list of service accounts and their hashes, and you can take those hashes and crack them with Hashcat or John the Ripper or whatever. So if there are a lot of those service accounts, which again, they're probably 80% of those service accounts in that particular example were probably no longer in use. And not only that, but they had weak passwords. That's one way that you can, you can kind of work through that issue of Kerber roasting. Just the way that on-prem AD works, the threat actor is going to be able to grab those hashes. Uh, but if they have really strong passwords and yes, 24 characters, I know that's crazy, but again, these are service accounts, right? These aren't just everyday user accounts. So they should, and those service accounts have extremely high privileges. So yes, give it a long password, multi-character, so that if that hash is grabbed by someone, they wouldn't be able to just crack it, because that's exactly what they're going to try to do. So MFA, remove quick assist, perform user access reviews, pay specific attention to those service accounts, uh, where Nick had mentioned Kerber roasting, and that's just kind of the start. As far as monitoring goes, so Nick and I were talking a little bit there, uh, and I forget exactly what Nick said, but he said something to the effect of basically, so EDR should have been able to pick up uh, when those files hit disk, right? Or he was talking about some of the fork and run method with Cobalt Strike and how EDR, almost all of them see it. Um, and so use EDR. I mean, even if it's Windows Defender, use something. It'll block a lot of these basic TTPs, the low hanging fruit, if you will, so that you make it much more difficult for them to actually operate, right? We talked a lot about data extortion or double extortion and data exfiltration. One thing that you can do is, if they're exfiltrating, these large amounts of data, there should be some sort of network monitoring in place, or, your EDR should be able to catch that. Most EDRs nowadays can. Most of the time, actually, the big thing that's been around for probably, I don't know, a couple of years now is XDR, which is a mixture of EDR and network detection and response. So when you put these two together, monitoring the endpoint and then actually monitoring the network traffic, you should be able to see that large amounts of data are coming off the network, right? And you'd be alerted on that and block it in most cases. When we do adversary emulation engagements, we will attempt to exfil large files just to see what happens. And in the times that we do get caught, it's because the network monitoring, aka XDR, um, saw that there was a large amount of data going out. And now that I think I might have answered my own question is when I asked Nick about the FTP, maybe one reason that they were doing it, they were exfiltrating that data to FTP servers, is that maybe it would fly under the radar of network monitoring, right? But you should be paying attention to things that are going on the endpoint and things that are going on in the network. A good place to start is Wuzzo. Wuzzo is an open source um, monitoring tool. Well, it's more than a tool platform. If you're a smaller or medium sized organization, this is a great place to start. There are enterprise offerings too, so it allows you to grow, right, as the organization gets bigger. But it is open source. Anyone can set it up. It's a good starting point. Of course, CrowdStrike is going to be appropriate for pretty much any organization, and we'll be able to handle a lot of these things. But basically, implement some sort of EDR network monitoring. The other option is, uh, if you're a big organization, you might be at the point where DLP, data loss prevention, is something that the organization needs to employ or is getting ready to employ. And so, uh, if you can employ something like Purview from Microsoft that does a lot of DLP, not that's what Purview does. It does DLP. Uh, you can um, use that for various exfiltration techniques and allow it to alert on you. Just this week, Microsoft actually released a whole bunch of security agents, so AI agents. One of those was the Microsoft Purview Agentic AI, I believe is the name of it, to where it works with your Microsoft DLP solution Purview, but it's an AI assisted method for DLP and for it'll also allow. So there's another agent that Microsoft just released that has to do with alerting as well. The ones that they released were specifically Microsoft Security Agentic AI. There's a whole bunch of them. I would recommend if you're a Microsoft shop to go check those out. Um, I'm sure we've all just been getting bugged by Microsoft for months now about Copilot and how great Copilot is. Uh, it's not bad. I think these agentic AI solutions are a step in the right direction. I do think that there's a lot of helpful stuff that they can use that can be used by these agents. Just side note, I do have concerns about the data privacy and data security with those. So, for example, Copilot. If you're using Copilot in your tenant, it has access to everything. Well, there's controls you can put in place, but it basically has access to data in your tenant. So by default, it has access to all the data in your tenant. So it has access to stuff in SharePoint, in Teams, and you name it, right? Power BI, whatever it is, Copilot has access to all that stuff. Um, and so I came super close. So you can ask Copilot, hey, give me a summary of all the emails between me and Nick, and it'll read my emails, it'll read Nick's emails, and it'll give you a summary. I came super close to getting it to show me our CEO's emails. Super close. But that's a story for another time. Point being, these security agents are the right step forward. There are still some concerns, but it's an excellent option if you're, a mature enterprise looking to, implement some additional protections. And of course, Yara rules. So if you aren't familiar with Yara rules, they're basically a framework for creating alerts and various logging and monitoring software. Most EDR platforms will actually give you the ability to create them or actually create it for you. So in CrowdStrike, for example, you can if you see a specific action taken on an endpoint, it'll generate that YAR rule for you. So you can literally just copy it and put it into your, whatever else you're using. But these YAR rules are out there. There's plenty of them for free, right? If you just go and look for, ransomware TTP YAR rules, you're going to see a whole bunch of them. They're a great way to be alerted when these types of things happen and kind of keep them up to date. But yeah, I mean, we're basically getting at do the basics, right? Do the basics is kind of what we're getting at here, if you haven't noticed. One other area that we think is important when it comes to defending against these types of attacks is around identity and access management. These are all 95% of ransomware attacks are done on traditional on-prem Windows Active Directory. And so there's a lot of different things that can happen. Of course, now with everything with Entra ID, and having, cloud-based, basically Entra ID is just Azure AD. I mean, it's a cloud-based version, but they sync together, right? So just because your organization is primarily on-prem Active Directory, but if you employ Entra ID, there's ways that threat actors can pivot from, public cloud services in Azure down into your on-prem Windows Active Directory network. And so, uh, one thing that we want to always make sure that we're looking at is, we want to perform regular review of enterprise applications in Entra ID. So last year, when the Russian SVR compromised the Microsoft corporate tenant, they did that through, basically, an enterprise application had a connection between a test tenant of Microsoft's and then their corporate tenant. And so the threat actors through that application were able to pivot through because that application had permissions in both tenants. A common attack that you see is called an illicit grant attack, to where threat actors will, through some sort of phishing page or other social engineering, ask a user to accept the permissions for an application. So they will make a Microsoft uh, app. Uh, they will send a link to the user, and maybe that app is called Document Review. They'll send a link to the user and they'll say, hey, user, you have important HR documents to sign. Please click this button to sign them. And what will happen is it'll bring them to the OAuth login, and the user will then grant access to that application, right? And so that's considered an illicit grant. And that application now has all those permissions that it asks of the user. It can then gain access to all the user's info, whatever that user has access to in Azure or wherever else that application now has access to. If the user performed that grant for the access. And so we always want to take a look at enterprise applications. You can do that in your tenant. And it's a big pathway, because just because it's Entra ID and the organization might be completely on-prem Active Directory, there's plenty of ways for them to pivot from the cloud down to, the on-prem. Talked about it already, but perform user and group access reviews in your IAM, especially in Entra, AWS, etc., is an absolute nightmare. I think we're kind of familiar with that. But you want to make sure that you're performing those. Before, we mentioned making sure that you're looking at the service accounts in on-prem Active Directory. But again, you want to make sure that groups are cleaned up, and users are decommissioned when they don't need to be around anymore.
Hey, Corey, you kind of just answered it, but we had a question come in. Any recommended method to perform access reviews?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can script it. So, um, Gabe, who does RIT, actually scripted it out to where he dumps all the users. Gabe, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is what Gabe does. He dumps all the users from Entra, and then he pulls them from all of our other tooling, and can actually basically gather all the users together, and what tools they have access to. And then we basically all go through them. So the way that he did it actually made things a lot easier, because you can see whether or not the user is active. In bigger organizations, this is definitely a challenge. There's no question about it. But I think the good place to start is to just go into, again, sticking with Microsoft, is to go into Entra ID, export the users, and then, so for example, a lot of big companies have contractors. This is something we see all the time. So a good place to start is to go through your contractors and see, is this contractor active or not? Um, the way that'll make user access reviews even easier is if you have proper onboarding and offboarding for IT. If you're doing offboarding when someone is, leaves or is let go, when it comes time to do those, especially with Entra, um, it'll make your lives 10 times easier. But there's other tooling out there as well, that can help you with it. But at the end of the day, user access reviews is it's a pretty manual task. The hardest part is just getting the data in the same place so you don't have to keep moving around, which again, for us, Gabe scripts that together and basically gets it into an Excel sheet that all the managers go and review at some point or another. So we do it quarterly. It's going to be a challenge. I wish I had better information, but it's going to suck. Just the way it is. The other one that I wanted to call out was during proactive testing. So if you're doing pen testing or red teaming or anything else, make sure that you're performing OSINT and collecting breach data and testing that. So the example I gave before was Change Healthcare. We know for a fact that ransomware crews, from the screenshot Nick shared, we know for a fact that ransomware crews are just looking at Citrix. They just want Citrix, and they are literally taking breach data and doing credential stuffing to see if they can get into that Citrix host. So if you're doing any sort of testing already, which you probably are, you should absolutely 100% include things like OSINT gathering, because that will get you the information around breach data and then allow those testers to use that breach data, because that's a huge attack surface. And you'll be able to identify misconfigurations in things like conditional access policies. You'll be able to find out whether or not you have breach data. You have active credentials in use that are in breach data. So I would absolutely 100% recommend. Of course, I'm the offset guy, but I would 100% recommend that you include OSINT gathering, breach data collection, and additional reconnaissance whenever you're doing any sort of penetration testing. And this one, you kind of have to call it out: least privilege. So this comes with having good strategies around providing permissions to the users that are in either your tenant or whatever the account is, whether maybe it's AWS. But zero trust has been talked about. It comes in waves. I think we're in another one of those big waves to where zero trust is getting talked about quite a bit. Least privilege is a core tenet of zero trust, which basically says, don't give employee A admin to everything, right? You should be only providing the specific permissions needed for that employee's job requirements. This is a reason why there are whole departments at big companies that are just focused on IAM. It's not easy. It is a challenge, but unfortunately, that's what threat actors are looking for. They're looking for accounts that are overly permissive, or they're looking for that account that was in breach data and it wasn't, the password wasn't changed. IAM is a challenge, and a lot of organizations struggle with it. But there's a lot of kind of basic stuff that you can do. That offboarding, IT employee offboarding specifically, you should have a whole procedure around what happens when someone leaves. Okay, first we remove their Asana. Okay, then we remove their SharePoint access. Then we do this with their OneDrive account, right? You should have very specific policies. I think that should be the biggest takeaway here is solidify your employee offboarding processes and policies. That'll save you a ton. So ransomware. So if we think about how they actually do it, they gain admin. So there's a couple steps, but basically when they gain access to an internal network, they need to gain typically administrator privileges. So that's why you saw Kerberos, because a lot of times those service accounts do have domain admin. But before they can just go and just encrypt everything, they need to have permissions to copy files and change files on systems across the network. And so they need to gain those privileges to do so. Most of the time it's domain admin. Of course, there's other roles in Active Directory that might have permission to, touch every single endpoint's files, maybe not make like big configuration changes on the endpoints, but there could be other roles that have that permission. But at the end of the day, they need to get that permission. Not only that, but they start on one compromised host and basically span out across the network, and start just basically copying the encrypting the files on each individual endpoint. What I've seen in the past is they basically run a psexec command that goes and loops through all the endpoints, and it copies an encryptor, runs a command, basically encrypt all files, and then it moves on to the next endpoint. So The thing about that is that they're most of the time sitting on a single host and they're able to access, you know, I don't know, 80% of all the endpoints on that network, which means that those networks are typically flat networks. So there's no network segmentation built into it. Are they're just completely flat. I mentioned MFA before, and one thing that I did want to call out is something that we're starting to see a little bit more of called microsegmentation. So zero networks, for example, if you wanted to RDP to another host, you need to authenticate again. So you need not authenticate, you need to be prompted for MFA again, and then it'll let you in to RDP to that host on an internal network now. The way Zero Networks does that is it basically on each endpoint, it shuts down the fire or it uses the firewall to shut down all the ports except like basic ones. But RDP, for example, the RDP port is closed by default. The RDP service is running on that host, but the firewall closes off that actual port. So when it sees a request come in to the RDP port, Zero Network says, okay, the request is coming from this username on this machine, and they pop up a box, and that user has to complete an additional MFA step before RDPing to that host. So Zero Networks has been around for a few years now, probably 3-4 years, somewhere around there. But they're starting to be this being adopted more and more in enterprise organizations because it's extremely effective. Uh, so that's one option, but definitely don't have flat networks. Consider microsegmentation such as Zero Networks. And sticking with the flat networks theory, you should have proper, you don't even need to be, the world's greatest network architect. These networks, again, those ransomware actors are typically on one host, hitting all the endpoints across the network. And so if that network is segmented off, they can't hit that. They can't do that. They can only hit the ones that are on their segment. So typically what you see just at a very high level is you'd see a management VLAN, which typically can hit, most things. You'll see a server VLAN, which of course for the servers, and then a user VLAN, which is where all the clients are. A lot of times, I didn't necessarily want to get into the whole discussion around network architecture and that kind of thing, but a lot of times you'll see Wi-Fi VLANs, you'll see guest Wi-Fi VLANs, but the point is that the network is segmented off, and there are specific firewall rules in between those different segments, right? So if you have a management VLAN, maybe one of those firewall rules is only let the MAC address from Corey admin to go from management VLAN to server VLAN, right? So even if something ends up in that management VLAN, if you're using firewall rules or some sort of other control, unless they're allow listed, they're not going to be able to move over to that server VLAN. So again, like most of the time, they're just on one host and they're spraying all the endpoints in the organization. And if you're able to block that from a network perspective, yeah, at that point you're already going to have a ransomware incident, but you'll be able to contain it. And not only that, it's going to make it much harder for them to move around the lateral movement that they're doing. It's going to make it much harder for them to move around and actually gain those administrative privileges that they need to actually pull it off and complete the encryption. Uh, One last thing I just want to touch on is continue to segment. Please make sure that IoT is segmented from the rest of the network. I mentioned Akira here. Recently, Akira ransomware crew was in a network. I believe they had gained access. I believe they had gained the administrative access that they needed, but every time they tried to do something, like some of those examples Nick was showing, they got caught by EDR. So they ended up in the network. They were on one endpoint. They tried a couple things. They got caught by EDR. They went to another endpoint to try a couple things. They got caught by EDR. Well, what did they do? They said, oh, they did. They looked around the network and they found an IP camera. And the IP cameras run Linux, most of them. Uh, so they connected to the IP camera, and they had credentials that they needed, but they were on that camera, and using SMB, they connected to all the endpoints on the network and encrypted them. So again, IoT should be segmented away. There's other concerns there, like why didn't the EDR see that happening and that kind of thing. But You should 100% be segmenting your network, especially when it comes to IoT and high profile assets. So
We did have one question come in, but I figured I would answer it. It was about anti-malware software detecting an intrusion. I would say if you're referring to just like antivirus, like Norton or something, um, typically they're not going to be as robust as like enterprise solutions like CrowdStrike, EDRs, and stuff like that. Um, One of the biggest things is to not have users be local administrator to their own machine because it gives them a lot more flexibility in disabling endpoint detection stuff. So if you're a local administrator on your machine, you can essentially just remove like Microsoft Defender or whatever it is. So that's a big thing is to keep users just low privilege users on their machine. They can't have like high integrity processes or anything like that. And then if it's not in the budget for like EDR, then yeah, I would say like Norton antivirus or some other like enterprise antivirus would be good. But looking into those free options like Wazza and building out your YAR rules yourself, you're going to learn a lot that way. But also, you're going to get better detections because they just have more visibility into processes and actions on the host that antiviruses just seem to not uh, be really doing right now. For the live demo, these are the things I'm going to show. Some of them have to do with the lab too, but this is by no means all of the TTPs that Black Basta uses. This is just the ones that we're pulling out that we think are interesting. I know I didn't discuss DLL sideloading, but they do use DLL sideloading for some defense evasion tactics. It's been reported in DEFA reports, and there were some talks of it in the chats. So I will demo that. And then the other things we already discussed in the slides. So I'll show that some of those in the lab and then some just on a standalone machine, but I can share my screen here. The first thing I wanted to show was that Quick Assist, and I wish there was more to show here really, other than yes, this is a Windows 10 VM and Quick Assist is installed. You could see the shortcut here refers to the system32 directory. There it is, quickassist.exe. And if you do hit the Control Windows Q key, it pops open. And it's really just a prompt with either get a code or like generate a code yourself. So if I do it on my host machine here, and these don't have to be on the same network or anything like that. All the threat actor might do is generate their own code and in their vishing call or whatever it is, give them their code. They're going to enter it and it just starts connecting. I mean, there's one barrier sort of protective layer, but it's not really much. It's basically a warning about, hey, if they're contacted unexpectedly, this might be a scam. There's no mentions of like ransomware or intrusion. Like this might be because scam is a little different than what like ransomware might be classified as. And all you really have to do is hit that check mark. I understand. And when we're talking about vishing or something like that, social engineering, this can easily be explained because it's saying if this person contacted you unexpectedly. I mean, if I was doing a social engineering engagement, I would simply work into the pretext that they contact me first. So whether that's from like spam email or like a watering hole situation where they see a website that they need to install like the new software, whatever it is. That way they're contacting you. And I mean, in this case, it kind of relieves that doubt. Like, did I contact them or did they contact me? Oh no, I contacted them. Okay, I'm going to allow. And after they hit allow, it's basically, you'll see on my host machine, it just opens up a screen sharing window, and it's kind of formatted weird because of the like resolution, but you can see their screen, and then you would hit request control like any like TeamViewer software, and they would just have to hit allow, which all of this would be kind of dealt with in the social engineering pretext. And then as you can see, I'm moving the mouse around, and I at this point you could open up CMD, type like some sort of one-liner, download a second stage, or if you wanted to keep it with legitimate software, you could go into the web browser and install like a secondary legitimate remote access tool like Atera or like AnyDesk. And that way you have persistent control over that machine. And this also gives them the opportunity to open up Task Manager, look at what potential defenses might be on the machine. That might determine what they're willing to drop on it. If it's has like some EDR, they might not drop some payloads. But and the other thing with the other remote desktop tools like Atera and stuff like that is a lot of times they're silent. So if I leave this, like the end user would not see that they are connected to a remote desktop session through Atera or something like that. It would look completely normal, and but the Black Basta operator, or whatever, would be able to perform actions normally with a remote desktop interaction, and the end user wouldn't see that. So that's really kind of all there is to show for the quick assist. I would recommend that you uninstall that through like group policy or something like that if you're not using it, which I don't think there's anything to really use it for if you have Intune or something like that where you can already remotely manage devices. So DLO sideloading is a defense evasion technique. It's also like an execution technique where you load a malicious DLL into a lot of times like into a legitimate process. So for this demo, I have PowerPoint, One or Outlook, OneNote. These are like the legitimate Windows, Microsoft binaries. You can see they're digitally signed and everything. But if I move them out of their folder, like here I have them in downloads folder, they're going to try to pull in DLLs that have different functionality that they need to be able to execute. And pretty much all Windows processes do this. But if we look at Process Monitor, so this is how you would kind of look for DLL sideloading conditions. You can set some filters in Process Monitor, which is part of the sysinternal suite. So these are just filters I've added. So we're matching where the process name is PowerPoint because we're specifying PowerPoint for this demo. And then we're looking at value where name's not found, meaning the DLL was not found at that location. And then checking the path to make sure it ends with DLL. So basically it's going to look for DLLs, events where DLLs were not found, stemming from this process parent PowerPoint.exe. So if we apply this and we start capturing events, and since I've moved PowerPoint out of its original location and I try to open it, it's not going to work. It's going to do some things and then it's going to fail because it doesn't have the DLLs it needs. But you can see a bunch of file creation. It's not actually creating the file. That's just like the name of the Windows API. And it's checking the local file, the local folder for these DLLs. So anything where it's users NIC, which is my downloads folder, it's checking for those DLLs. And if it were there, it would load that DLL into memory. And so that's useful because as a local user, not even an administrator user, we can write to this folder. So in terms of defense evasion, I've pulled one of the DLL names that I know will work because I was testing before this, but we can just create a simple DLL here. So in Visual Studio Code, we've created the outline template for a DLL, and all it's really going to do is define a character array. It's going to check the current process ID, and then it's just going to format that into a string and say, hello, this is like the current process ID in a message box, because message boxes, I don't know what the plural is for that, but it will show over the UI, whereas like a print statement will not show because it's a DLL. It doesn't have a console attached to it. So if we rebuild that DLL, all we would need to do is come here, and it's right here. So we can drag it into that local directory, and I'm just going to copy the name here. I kind of named it that so I could copy it. That's the name of the legitimate DLL we saw that I picked out from the process monitor. And when you go to load it, it loads the DLL, and we know that because it popped open the message box, and it says hello from PID process ID 14852. So if we go to process hacker, we can see that it actually is the PowerPoint process. So our code is executing under the context of the PowerPoint.exe process, and we didn't do process injection or anything like that. We just put a DLL next to it. It loaded the DLL, and then we got code execution under that signed binary process. So this is a very useful technique for defense evasion because it's being executed under the context of that signed binary, and we're not doing process injection things like allocating memory and all that stuff. So I hope that makes sense. The DLL here is not very malicious. It's just opening a message box for demonstration purposes. And then the process here is going to die because it doesn't have, oh, it's going to do it again. It doesn't have the DLLs that it needs to run, but you can craft a payload where it continues running. It has the other DLLs that it needs and continues to run, but also loads the malicious code. And Black Basta was seen doing this. I think they were side loading a DLL for like the OpenSSL binary, which I was looking into briefly. I wasn't sure which one they were doing or what the actual like social engineering pretext, or if there was one for that, would be. But a lot of EDRs are picking up on this kind of process now. So one of the main things would be this DLL we created is not signed by Microsoft. So if that DLL is typically signed and this one's not signed, and it wouldn't pass any sort of like checksum hash because it's, we just made it ourselves, that would be an indicator. And then also, I know Elastic has some rules for recently copied DLL or process where the DLLs loaded into that process would be suspicious because we recently copied, both of these to a directory, then we launched it, and now it's loading into that process. Because typically these things would just be in like program files, and the program files directory, they wouldn't change. I will switch over to my Kali VM because the other two I want to show we can do in the lab. So the next thing I wanted to show was Kerberoasting. I know we talked about Kerberoasting a bit here, but they were seen using it with Rubius, which is I have it here, a legitimate, just open source tool for doing OffSec stuff with Kerberos. So one of the subcommands here is to dump those hashes for those ticket granting service tickets for the service accounts. And there's, documentation. You guys can go like play with this. And typically you would compile it and, run it on an endpoint. But a lot of these C2 frameworks have the ability to just run it in memory in the process that you're executing from using like execute assembly, which is a Cobalt Strike command. In this case, for the lab and for this demo, I'm showing it with Mythic, which is a C2 framework that you can basically build your own agents for and stuff like that. But I'm using the Apollo payload, and you guys will use the Apollo payload. And let me just make sure I was named that right. Yes, the Apollo payload. I wasn't sure if it was Apollo or Athena. But yeah, so in this payload, there is a built-in command called execute assembly, and it basically you can run things, you can run .NET assemblies specifically, like Rubius. So if we wanted to simulate what Black Basta was doing, we could, I have a callback, a beacon here, just pretend this is like Cobalt Strike or something. And we have execution on the host. It's calling back to me over HTTPS, and I'm getting, output from commands I'm running. So if I wanted to do a Kerberoasting attack, I could do something like this, and I'll try to make it like big enough so people can see pretty easily, where I'm executing the assembly Rubius with the subcommand Kerberoast, and then I'm formatting that in Hashcat format for hash cracking later. And then no wrap is just like a formatting thing. And this is typically the command you would run and then copy the output from the from like the console here. And this errors out because I didn't register the assembly yet. So you guys will have to do this in the lab, where you go here and you do new assembly, and then you choose the file. I'm going to execute it with no arguments to make sure it's there. And then we should just see like the help text for Rubius. Just give it a second. So we see the help text, which this is the help text from the actual like executable file. So that means we ran it in memory successfully. So if we were going to do the Kerberoasting attack now that we've registered that file in Mythic, that's a Mythic specific thing, and so we can see, sorry about the formatting here. Here's these hashes that it returns back. So these are service accounts. Here's the service principal name, and then you get this big hash, which is basically cryptographically signed with the password of the service account. So if you cryptographically break the hash, then you can recover the plain text password for it. And you would take these hashes offline now, and you could then crack them. And this is exactly what Black Basta was doing in those commands they sent. Although, if we wanted to exactly simulate what they were doing, they were actually writing it to disk in program data in a file called hs.txt. They called it different things and different, like in different chat messages. But in this case, it should write it. So we wrote it to disk, and it's actually in a file like on the victim machine now, which is sort of interesting because, again, like we talked about, that's a good opportunity for detections. So we could download that file, and then and these actions would be pretty much the same when they're doing them from Cobalt Strike. It's just like what C2 framework they're using. Most of them are doing the same sort of things. So if we downloaded it and opened it, you can just see the very specific format that these hashes are in, and then you could take these and try to crack them, try to find higher privileged domain users and stuff like that, or see if any of these service accounts are higher privileged domain users. So that's the Kerberoasting. I hope I covered that well. Does anybody have any questions about that before I move on to data exfil? So for data exfil, like we talked about, they're using rclone. This is a legit like tool, rclone.org. You can go download it, standalone binaries for rclone for Windows, Mac, Linux, all the different things. And it basically lets you sync files to remote locations. So you need to configure a .conf file. You can either do it through like an interactive prompt from the executable, or you can create it and then transfer it. I've already created one through like the interactive prompt, but you can just copy it to remote host, which is what they were doing. So I created a .conf here. It's a profile. You just name your profile. In this case, we're syncing the file to Mega. Then there's a hash for the password. So that's not the actual password. And that's the account for the Mega account. If we look at the Mega account in the browser, you can see I synced one of the directories already to it. And the actual commands to sync to Mega, all you have to make sure you do is, we'll jump over to this other tab. So we're on a callback on a different machine now, but all you basically have to make sure that you do is transfer the rclone binary to the victim machine, transfer the configuration to the victim machine, which I have. It'll by default look in the C users app data roaming. So if I check there, and it would be the current user. So we have that configuration file placed there because that's where the binary is going to look for it. And then we can just run it using like a shell command, and we can list the files in that remote share. So Mega, we're passing Mega because it's the name of the profile, and it'll execute the binary. We can actually see that it's connecting to Mega, and it's showing me those files that I just looked at in the Mega in the Mega UI. So you guys will do this in the lab, but it's one of the last steps. But in terms of exfiltrating the data, all we would need to do, and in those examples I showed, they were literally syncing the entire user's directory of a victim machine to the FTP server. In this case, we'll just do this small directory for the lab's sake, and you can just pass the local directory and then the remote Mega profile with the name of a new directory. And it's pretty quick with how it syncs files too, which makes it a very good tool for data exfil when you're trying to do these things very quickly before anything gets detected, and then you're going to start encrypting files. You won't get any output, and you could see it basically syncs that whole directory up there. Pretty basic tool, but when used for data exfiltration, it's very easy and effective. And again, it's a legitimate signed binary from rclone.org, unless it's added to something like a potentially unwanted program list, or specifically blocked through like WDAC or like something like that, then it's most likely just going to be allowed to run, unless you have those detections in place looking for it. That kind of sums up what I had for the hands-on demo.